Hey, welcome back to Common Sense OT Security. Today, I am joined by Joel Langill, who many of you will know as the SCADA hacker. And the reason for this is, first of all, because I just like him to join the party here. I think he is one of the important voices in our community. So welcome, Joel.
And thank you, Ralph.
And the other reason is that I think OT security training is a topic worth looking at, worth discussing. Let me quickly give you my experience with OT security training. So, full disclosure, I never participated in any course, in any formal training whatsoever, maybe only for the reason that I started my OT security journey in the late 90s. There was no training option. Actually, we started with offering training to our clients. And from there, we went into consulting. And then 20 years later, we got out of consulting. Today, as you will know, we are focusing on the OT-based OT asset management system. But, I used to have this continued interest in the training space because every now and then I wonder, well, so there are so many experts these days, so many OT security experts, and if I listen to their talking points, I wonder where they have learned that, and then looking a little bit closer to some training material. So, for example, I have here Exhibit 1. This is the SANS ICS Cybersecurity Field Manual. And honestly, I have to tell you, a lot of things don't make sense to me. But anyhow, so this is just me. And since I have not that great exposure to the training field, I thought, let's just bring on the expert, Joel, the SCADA hacker Langill, and let him educate us about what's going on in the training sector. Joel, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph, and it's an honor to be here next to you today on this nice Tuesday afternoon. Yeah, there's a lot of history here, and I always kind of like to preface with a little bit of my background. I've only really done one thing my whole life, and that was work as a control systems engineer. I was a cooperative engineering student with General Electric, working on the machines that made light bulbs when I first got started, back when I was just starting my freshman year of college. Then I worked for a major oil company, Shell Oil, where, again, I was a control systems engineer working in one of their large assets in the southern part of the United States. And then I ended up going to work for just about 20 years with Honeywell Process Solutions, working on designing, helping to sell, design, maintain, and support control systems around the world. And that's probably where I got the vast majority of my experience, because the one thing that I believe when we start talking about training, and of course, I should preface this, in about 2011 is when I finally decided to take that big move and enter the training space. And if you're coming to S4 in Miami next month, you're going to see my tagline as I'm one of the OGs of OT. I think that people like Ralph, Dale Peterson's another one, Jonathan Pollitt had training that started before mine. But when I entered that training space, I wanted to focus on one very important aspect, because I was doing training for customers and internal personnel at Honeywell for a long time on new systems, functionality and capabilities, as well as a lot of competitive analysis. It's important that training teaches you a skill that you can usually translate into some financial benefit to the people that are paying the bill. Training is not necessarily inexpensive, especially when you start to throw in the cost of the travel and living aspect of it. You're usually in the 5 figures for a course that is worth the effort. But what I started to see very quickly is that live training gave you an interaction with students that virtual training does not. So I'm very clear, even though I offer virtual courses, I don't believe that virtual training is effective. For 3 years, I taught remotely for Texas A&M University on an advanced 400 level course on industrial cybersecurity. And even though there was a textbook that I co-authored with Eric Knapp that aligned perfectly with the course content, students wouldn't read the textbook. They wouldn't put in the extra effort that it really takes to become a true OT cyber engineer. So with time, and again, working with people that have helped mentor me along, one of them being, of course, Dale Peterson, who again has invited me down to visit the training roundup to talk about training, where I'm going to present a lot of this stuff in open dialogue. I believe that when we look at training, we can break it down into two buckets, okay? There's a bucket around what you should expect from a training organization. And there's another bucket that you and your employer should expect that you receive as a result of the training that can translate into some benefit, whether or not it's tangible or not, to the company you work for. Of course, it could be your own company. If you work for yourself, you still would want to invest in training and hopefully see a return on your investment. So let's start with the training organization. I believe there's three key aspects that a training organization should possess. Actually, I should remove should, but must, if they're going to be effective. The first is an experience-based organization of individuals. These individuals should have experience on control system platforms, whether or not they're SCADA systems or distributed control systems, because those two systems are vastly different from one another. They should also have experience with control system suppliers. You only have Rockwell experience, you're probably not going to be as valuable if you walk into a Honeywell installation. Or if you have Siemens experience, you might not be so good with Rockwell. You also, the most important thing is you need to have industry sector exposure. You need to be able to understand there is a huge difference between walking into an oil refinery and walking into a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. Vastly different. Their goals, their operational objectives, their safety parameters are all very different. And in order to be an effective individual, you need to possess that capability. So I always like to blend in stories when I talk about stuff like this. And probably one of the ones that was the eye opener for one of my customers is I got exposed to heavy rail when I joined a government contracting organization. And the reason is they also had a huge transportation business. And one of them was on heavy rail. And I didn't have a lot of experience in rail. So I walked into one of their outstations, opened the door, and I said, son of a bitch, that is a triple modular redundant safety system. And they looked at me and they go, what? I go, okay, you probably don't call it a safety system. They don't. But when I just looked at the physical aspect of that system, I could see everything was triplicated. 3 cards for inputs, 3 cards for outputs. And what they did is their differentiator is they don't call it safety related IO, they call it vital and non-vital IO. So the vital IO is what we would consider as the stuff that's usually triplicated, so that you have to have 2 out of 3 agreements in order for the action to get passed. But it's that kind of exposure that immediately adds value to the situation. And you can get that a lot of ways. But the first thing is getting out, getting in the field. Of course, the one thing I also express, and one of the first things I look at candidates is what safety training they've had prior to any field engagement. The petroleum industry in particular is very, very particular about training. I mean, there's formal courses held by community colleges to get this type of training, because it's not a 1-hour video you sit and watch, which, like the training for the rail infrastructure, was a couple-hour course, but it's nothing like the oil and gas industry. So especially like if, say, you go out on a platform.
Maybe let me chime in here and just add some additional context. So when I remember our consulting years, the one thing that we learned rather quickly, which is without any process understanding of the physical process, you don't go anywhere. And that is something that I believe is important for the newcomers to realize. Well, let's just say you know everything about how to hack a Siemens PLC or Rockwell PLC or whatever, right? But that only gets you so far, because OT security is about securing the physical process, not the PLC. And if you don't have that process understanding, you cannot really perform. And let me tell you how I figured that out the hard way in our in our consulting practice. So we went on to those assignments and came up with all those cool ideas how we could mess the process up. And then usually a control engineer or process engineer said, no, that's not possible. And then they provided a logical explanation because they had already thought about scenarios where X, Y, and Z would happen. And then they made sure that it could not result in disaster. And so that actually might have taught me as much, if not more, than all the theoretical understanding of how you could mess with a PLC. And so long story short, at least finally, after a couple of years, we got to that point where when we presented our scenarios, they said, oh shit, you are right. We hadn't thought about that. Right? And so I think that's a very important aspect just for our listeners to keep that in mind. You will need that deep process understanding, which probably the usual training outfits will not teach you.
That's very valid. It's very true. And that's why I was looking at the syllabus and some of the stuff associated with a training organization, and they're teaching you how to program a PLC in a cybersecurity class. And it's like, I think that's a complete waste of time. If you want to learn how to program a PLC, I'd take a community college class and learn how to do it right and get exposure to a variety of PLCs. Because I'll be very honest, it's very different configuring a Siemens PLC than it is a Rockwell PLC. And it's also very different configuring a Siemens toy PLC like the S7 1200s versus a real workhorse like an S7 400, which supports triple modular redundancy and so on and so forth. Because I'll tell you right now, to hack a TMR-based system, even to hack a remote-based system, is very sophisticated. And that's why in my ethical hacking class, the range that I actually expose people to is based on a fully redundant top to bottom, meaning IO's redundant, networks are redundant, switches and firewalls are redundant, workstations are distributed, servers are redundant, and so on. And say, okay, let's talk about how you would exploit what's really out there versus somebody that installs a PLC with no security, poor configuration, and so on. So let's talk about the next aspect of what a training organization would provide. They should provide capability. Capability is a very broad statement, but that is a capability for you to learn continuously and excel over time. The way that I chose to do that is by implementing a true learning management system. Learning management systems are vital because it's not just a website with a bunch of facts. Sure, if you go to either of my websites, SCADAhacker.com or icscsi.org, there's lots of websites with a lot of stuff, but that's not a learning management system. A learning management system teaches you, reinforces the learning, right? Because there's kind of three aspects to learning. Is one of them seeing something, another one is actually doing it yourself in the form of written exercises, and of course the third is the reinforcement aspect through examination and retention. Another capability that people must provide are systems. I am shocked that still the vast majority of training entities are teaching you SCADA only. And I'll be very honest with you, SCADA is a vital aspect of our infrastructure, but it is also not the real workhorse behind the infrastructure. Most of the core work in infrastructure is done through much more reliable, much more redundant, resilient systems like distributed control systems. So you could take a look at the electric utility sector. The systems that control power generation are very different than the systems that control transmission and distribution, right? Another thing that's important for an entity to have is awareness of different architectures. For instance, one of the things that I always throw out in my training is I show a dual-honed network architecture. And of course, people will say, you can't do that. You're not supposed to do that. And I say, says who? Well, that's what IT says. And I go, well, tell IT to push off, right?
Yeah, and certainly I would say, well, that is something that you find in pretty much any OT environment. So dual home is the name of the game. and if you hear that reaction, you already know, oh, this guy probably has never been on a factory floor.
That's exactly true. And that's why even in my basic class, the architecture I use, because we all know that it's fairly easy to secure a Windows-based whether it's a workstation or a server. But to directly secure a programmable controller can be difficult. So many leading companies, Emerson for one, Siemens is another, they actually created this dual-honed architecture. So in order for you to get to the gold, the controller, you have to first compromise that much more difficult asset that's upstream of it. And that's why people, when I look at these class architectures that they show, I go, that's not realistic. Even in my basic class that only has a half a dozen assets, the architecture is realistic. It's just not scaled, because it could be a huge system, but it's just a lot of repetition of the same thing. And of course, that leads us to the next important capability that an organization should have, and that's a cyber range. And that's what I believe is our key differentiator. My range is probably one of the most advanced because it's based entirely on OT. So when you get on there and you do scans, you actually see OT devices, not virtual machines. You see PLCs, not somebody emulating a Modbus server, because there's more to this world than Modbus. So let's create an architecture that's realistic. And then, of course, the other thing that's kind of nice to have is the ability to do both defensive cyber education and offensive cyber education. Now, I've been very cautious of releasing an OCO class because that capability is not something to play with. And again, that's why there's others that say they offer it, but I guarantee you they're not actually teaching the true offensive cyber operations, because OCO, you need to be able to get in there and not let yourself be discovered. And that's one thing that in DCO, or defensive cyber operations, we teach. And then the last capability that I'm a huge advocate of, and it's on, let's see, I even have a little slide here. If I call this thing up, hopes it doesn't show up on here. There it is that I believe that training needs to be structured for job function. So everybody that actually has anything to do with industrial automation and control should have some form of training, whether that's a manager or a supervisor of an operational area of a plant, all the way down to the technicians that support it, should go through some form of training. And this is not a one size fits all. The amount of training that a manager needs is very broad and very non-specific, where when you get into training the actual people that support and maintain systems, it becomes very important. And that's one thing that I kind of get an interesting kick out of. If you would look at my roster over the years, very few people from the maintenance side of businesses attend training. It tends to always be the engineer. Now, we started doing work with Department of Defense and Department of Energy, and in those cases, we did get people from Public Works to come in and actually start taking these cybersecurity training programs. And of course, the deeper you go in job function, whether it's as you're an operations person who interacts with this on a daily basis, or a maintenance and support person, it's very different training, but it's very customized to them. And that's why this relevance becomes key, is that you need to address it across the board. And one thing that I'm disappointed as heck for is probably one of the best papers ever written by Homeland Security, was how to do procurement practices for industrial control systems, where they actually put text in there to have you add to purchasing requisitions that drive a strong security platform. Because I'll be very honest, for 20 years, I installed control systems, and most of the time, security was never considered until the very end, when people would try to add it as a feature rather than design it as a concept. Okay, so you've gone to training, and hopefully you've gained some knowledge, you've gained some skills, but what else would you expect? So for me, if you're going to be the best OT cybersecurity engineer, you probably need to have some foundation of OT. And again, there's a lot of different job functions in that space, but I find it very difficult to teach people concepts of control when they've never seen a controller in their life. So for me, I start out very basic. In one of my courses, I use your home as an example. Homes have a ton of control systems. So to teach the basic concepts, I try to relate it to something they can understand. It could be as simple as your oven, right? There's a sensor in there that monitors temperature. You've got an actuator that turns on electricity or turns on fire to control that temperature. And then you've got some kind of a set point mechanism that's determining the control. Okay, you look at that, you've got water heaters, you've got air conditioning systems. We can go on and on and on. Perfect place to learn. But without that concept, I think that whole introductory section of OT training for most companies just goes right out the window because they're going, huh?
You do realize, though, that this is a slippery slope, right? Because these days, everything is full of control systems, if you will. I mean, if you look at our cars, another anecdote that I want to share here is a couple of years ago, I had been invited to discuss with the cybersecurity guys of a large aircraft manufacturer, passenger airplanes. You might guess what the name is of the company. And they told me right out of the bat, but Ralph, a passenger airplane is just a gigantic flying control system. So basically, if you think about it, in these days, you have control systems everywhere. You don't necessarily realize it.
What's really funny about planes is it's actually kind of scary in the early days. I'll get rid of that map over there. When they started to do in-flight Wi-Fi, there was a pretty large group of us that have been around a bit that said, this is really going to be a bad idea unless you let people come in and take a look at it. And Boeing is a very arrogant entity. And I'm sorry if there's people from Boeing on this podcast, but they made a very fatal error. So I said, fine, I'm going to get on there and we're going to see. And sure enough, it took me a matter of minutes to find out that the whole infrastructure was being controlled by a Palo Alto firewall. And I'm like, okay, so that's step one. And it wasn't long after that people were actually able to breach that barrier. I wouldn't do that because that's crossing the line. And once they breached the barrier, they saw that all of the passenger information system and the flight management infrastructure converged on a single network that finally left the plane through transmission. And I mean, that's stupid. I mean, we would never do that in industry. I mean, the first rule we learn in security is to separate critical and non-critical. But IT wants to throw that stuff.
I'm not so sure about we would never do it if I see the rush to the cloud, right? Come on. So
I agree.
I've seen a lot of stupid things that I had thought, well, they would never do that, but then they did. You think they will never do that until they actually do. And why? Well, because it's cheaper. Right? And
right.
What could happen?
Well, it's funny when you look at some of these mistakes, right? And another good one is, so there was a researcher that, about 10, maybe a little more than 10 years ago, dumped a bunch of vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities actually were pretty credible. He did a good job. You might all know Luigi. He was a different character, but he was very good at what he did. So I looked at one of those and I started to do some recon on some customers that I had that I knew used that system. And sure enough, the first one I went to actually put down a reference list of the installations that they provided this system to. And I'm just going, this is not looking good. So the first one they put was the United States Department of Defense. The next one they put was the Beijing Traffic Management System. The next one they put was the new terminal at Heathrow Airport. And you sit there and go, you have got to be kidding me. The major oil companies that were my customers for many years had strict practices. They would never allow that to happen. You do not say that Acme Manufacturing is installing Honeywell's latest Experian control system. That was forbidden. But here we are seeing it. So made a few calls, worked with my friend Eric Byers. We got in touch with the vendor and said, please remove that until we get control of this. They refused. So then we called the people that were listed and come to find out that the control system that was in suspect actually, for instance, at the Department of Defense, was that responsible for controlling the HVAC system on their data center. Now, that's where you start to go, you've got to be kidding me. So they figured it's a non-classified system, unclassified, I should say. So their restrictions are different than if it was classified. And you're going, man, this is insane. So what did DOD do to fix this problem? Not a single thing. Same thing. I walked into another government installation. This was in 2017, 2018. I looked at the control system and I go, this is a 1994 Foxborough IA system, and it hadn't been touched in 20 years. And you're looking at it going, and they laugh. They go, how did you know that? I go, well, back in the day, we did things. We were trying to get into the Unix world rather than proprietary. And we used a lot of Unix, not Linux, Unix. And I could see the little Hummingbird logo on their HMI because we were using Hummingbird to be our GUI interface into these Unix systems. So in comes another capability that you should expect out of training are some actual skills that you can do. Skills that can help you turn value into your customer. And again, normally most of us in this business work for a contractor that provides services to end users. Again, we do train a lot of end users, but the net value is the same. So the first skill you need, and one of the first concepts I teach, and it was interesting until I started slamming these other organizations, they never taught anything on risk management. And I just said, this is a joke. Do you realize that cybersecurity is the result of risk management? And that's why a single vulnerability without context does not mean squat, because it's different in the environment in which it's installed. And I'll tell you right now, the physical security of an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia is vastly different than the physical and cybersecurity of an oil refinery in the United States on the Gulf Coast. Completely different risk profiles. Same systems. I installed systems in both places. I worked for Shell. We had the same control system that several oil companies in the Middle East had and still do. Same system, same basic components, same CVEs exist on both systems, but the security profile was vastly different, and how they chose to manage risk was also vastly different. But nobody seems to teach that, and that's a big concern for me. My whole course was focused on, and again, it would depend on the depth you want, how to conduct a threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment, because they're all key. In order to introduce security, rather than follow some stupid document that lists 575 things that you're supposed to do to be secure, you need to actually look at this from a threat versus risk.
Well, let me chime in here, because I am sometimes I'm under the impression that maybe our good folks in the field, they try a little bit too hard to push the risk. So I'm aware of I don't know, hundreds of disastrous risk scenarios where you can easily point out, well, no, that's completely overblown. So when it comes to your point, Joel, I think the important distinction is you have to make it credible, which is what many people fail to do. Many OT security experts, many aspiring OT security people. So certainly you should analyze the risk, even though I'm not a particular friend of the terminology, but that's another thing. But you have to make it credible, because when the public, whoever learns about OT security, we are bombarded with these Armageddon scenarios that never happened. And then if you engage in this type of conversation, then it will become very easy to dismiss your whole point, which is something that you don't want to happen. And that is something that I try to do in our consulting here, is always make it very specific, like what you had alluded to. If I do, or an attacker would do this and that, then this thing will explode for sure. And you can ask the control engineer, and he nods his head, yeah, good, that's true. So then I think you have a chance to actually make a difference. And this is, in my understanding, the biggest problem in OT security is the execution piece. So you have to, at some point in time, get after the budget, right? So the majority of OT security operations are hopelessly underfunded. That is what you need to change. Your biggest enemy is not the hacker. It's maybe the CEO, right? The board, or whatever you want to call it. First, you need to get the budget. And in order to get the budget, you need to build your case, and you would incorporate your risk analysis, etc., but make it credible. Anyhow, so we are at the end of our little show here. Thank you very much, Joel, for all the insights. And let me remind everyone that you can see both of us at S4 next month in Miami. We have a prime sponsor room there, and Joel does his thing. I think, Joel, you're also, for the whole show, you're in Miami. Is that correct?
That is correct. I'll arrive Monday afternoon and leave. I got to leave Thursday midday.
Yeah. Okay. So just use the opportunity to bump into us. If you come to our sponsor room, you might even get a free drink or whatever, and some fancy T-shirts. I don't know. One final thing: if you also have a desire to be on this webcast, just let us know. I'm always interested in stimulating the conversation and talk to some interesting people. With that being said, thank you very much, Joel, and we'll see each other in the next show next week. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you. Bye.